Okay, let's take a look at TCP IP, a little bit more detail than we've done in the past. Let me get my pen going here. Right. So what do we got? Transmission control protocol or internet protocol, right? Two protocols that make up a suite, right? There's a whole bunch of protocols under this umbrella, but we call it TCP IP, right? Yeah, hence the suite. Huge history behind it. Got its start in the 1960s. This has been around for a long, long time, 40, 50, 60 years. I think about that. It's a grandfather, right? So it was the precursor to the internet. We still use IP addresses on the internet. This should tell you, where that comes from. So huge history, and as in most things in tech, it has its roots in some Defense Department project. What are the advantages? Here, this is really the advantage that, concerns most of your bosses. Money, 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 right? There's no license to use TCP IP. It's open to anybody who can employ it, right? So you don't have to pay IBM or Microsoft or anything. IBM was a small company back in the 60s. Well, not too small, but smaller than it is today. Microsoft didn't exist. So it's relatively cheap in that it's free. It's flexible. Here's the cool thing. All major platforms use it, right? So it runs on virtually anything, including your cell phone, all right? It's routable, right? So I can send a packet from a device and get it to go to a device, right? So I can route this information to a specific IP address, okay? All the different protocols under the TCP IP suite add to the data its own bit of information, its own part of the entire frame, all right? So as you're working down the OSI model layers, right, you keep adding things to that data, or when you're receiving the packet, taking things away from that data. Layers 5 through 7, 7, 6, and 5, right? That data is known as the payload. Why is it the payload? Because, when you get it, it's payday. Yay, it's the payload. Right? So that's your actual data. Right? Anything beyond that is what you need to communicate. It's all the other stuff that gets added. And if you remember, 7, 6, and 5 are application, session, and presentation layers, right? So those all deal with the app. The one that's used here, HTTP, classic, right? That gets me a web page. Great. But the web page information itself is just what I need to consume. It's not what's needed to transmit that information to me. So if we look at those three layers, the entire trip that it's going. So I have, an HTTP page that I want to view. This is kind of from me to another device. So say this is my web browser up here, or my web server, excuse me. Right? So I'm looking at it from the web server side. It says, hey, I have a web page. Great. The application that's doling out the IIS, right? Internet Information Services system that's doling out these web pages says, great, I have a web page for you. So the application hands that off to the presentation layer, but it's still HTTP. The session layer says, all right, great. Here's my data. I'm going to format it, but it's just the payload. I'm not adding anything to it. I'm just converting the payload into a format that's going to be transportable. Layer 4 and below is where the action really occurs. So layer 4, right? So that's your TCP, your transport layer. If you think TCP for transmission control protocol, think transmission is transport, right? So T for T. So your transport layer is where your TCP header or information is added to your data or your payload or your datagram, user datagram protocol, right? So it's either your transmission header or my datagram, my UDP header that's getting added there at that layer. Layer 3, that's my network layer. Not a very good W. It's my network layer. So now we're talking about what? Right? IPs. Okay. So your IP address gets added to the packet, or excuse me, the data at the layer 3 device. Layer 2 device, right? That's my transport network. Come on, I'm drawing a blank. You know what it is. I'm literally drawing a blank. Okay, thank you. Data link layer. It's right in front of me. Right, data link. Right. So now we're talking my switch. Right. What's on there? Well, NIC. What do NICs have? NICs have MACs. Right, MAC address. So my MAC address gets added on at my layer 2. Right. The only thing left then is layer 1, which is physical. So I'm adding information onto my data, onto my payload at each one of these layers. My TCP packet information gets added on layer 4, my IP address at layer 3, and my MAC address at layer 2. Right, so keeping up with that graph, there's that bit of data right there is what gets added on, on my layer 4. Notice, I'm calling everything data up until layer 4. On layer 4, I start calling it a segment. Why? Because it's no longer just data. On layer 3, I start calling it a packet. When I add that IP address on, my routers are dealing with packets. Okay? On layer 2, my data link layer, I'm calling it a frame. Why? Because a frame isn't a whole packet. Frame is that Ethernet stuff, my MAC address. Right? So I'm breaking it down smaller and smaller parts and naming those parts different because they're not the same as what came before. So data becomes segment, segment becomes packet, packet becomes frame. On layer 1, here's where the nasty business of converting everything to binary occurs. So I'm converting it to bits. What do bits look like? Well, on a wired NIC, they're electrical impulses. Right? On a fiber NIC, they're light pulses. Right? And on a Wi-Fi, they're RF transmissions, right? Amplitude or frequency modulated transmissions. So there's my graph in its entirety. So I've added TCP information at layer 4, IP information at layer 3, Ethernet information at layer 2, and then I finally convert it to zeros and ones, pulses of some sort. And when I'm transmitting, I'm adding those things. I'm encapsulating all that information on block by block. I transmit it as zeros and ones. And when it gets to the other device, each one is removing, a piece of that puzzle. Physical data link turns the physical dashes and dots into, values, right? Network layer pulls off the MAC address. Transport layer has the IP address, data link layer pulls off the MAC address, network layer pulls off the IP address, transport, now I get TCP, and then the session presentation application processes the payload, right? So I'm encapsulating and de-encapsulating as I go up the other side. And here's just that same information in a different form. So application, presentation, and session are all data. Transport, segment, or datagram, depending on whether it's TCP or UDP, right? I still have my pen here. Let me get this guy. All right, TCP or UDP, right? And then my packet, my frame, and my bit, right? So as I move down, I'm getting these things smaller and smaller. Well, I'm adding more and more information to it, right? And that's the end of part 1 for TCP IP. We're going to go into TCP and UDP a little bit more detail, and there's a third part coming up at the end. So if you have questions about this, you know where I'm at.